Welcome to our Sustainable Business Network session on product footprinting. This session was recorded in December 2024.
We've got a little bit of a different structure for you in this morning's session, and it is all about product footprinting, which is incredibly topical. So just to run you through what the agenda is, we have the usual legislation and market update that I will be leading up on. And then we have the main overview on the topic from Dan Lovelace and Tom Vaughan from Carbon Footprint. You've already seen today there is a QR code on the screen, and we'll be using that to drive the discussions that we'll have for the panel session. And I'm delighted to have Harsha Thomas from De La Rue and Leah Matthews-Collins from Vitacrest on the panel today. Let's have a look at what's been happening in the world in the couple of months since we last met. Here are things pictorially. I'm not going to describe things in great detail, safe to say. On your left-hand side, we've got the things happening on a global level, and moving across to the right, things happening more close to home. Let's dive in and have a look at what that all means. COP29 took place in Azerbaijan. I'm not going to read off what all these things are here, but I think there's something close to 80,000 delegates went to the meeting. A lot of them flew there, and it was a bit of a shame that the calculator working out their emissions is actually out by a factor of 2. Let's move on. Some of the headlines in that, in terms of climate finance, and what was hoped for from the developing nations wasn't achieved. So yes, $300 billion has been committed by developed nations, but this is, I think, about a quarter of what was actually being asked for, which was closer to 1.2 trillion. So missed the mark by quite a bit. There was some development over carbon markets, and this is, in essence, how developed nations can meet their targets using carbon credits. And this was really to make that system a little bit more robust. It wasn't really anything particularly new, in our opinion there, but still good for that to be as robust as possible. I'm going to move on in the interest of time here, because I think most of you are familiar with those other findings there from the COP meeting. Obviously, that happened at the same time that this was sort of happening. We just had the American election, and these two gentlemen here, I note, are wearing very different coloured ties. So it's going to be interesting to see how that all pans out. Whether Mr. Musk there is going to use his influence to on Mr. Trump to make him perhaps a little bit more amenable to the climate agenda. Who knows? Or maybe it's just about doing better business and tariffs and things, so it doesn't disadvantage any of his business interests. We shall see. Interesting times from January. Getting closer to home then, and actually another nod to COP29 that Keir Starmer did announce some, really ambitious targets there for 2035 for the UK, and that's really good. There were one or two naysayers back here in the UK. The Committee on Climate Change questioned whether that was achievable in the published strategy that we know already. But can't knock him for ambition. So let's see what happens from there. Obviously, we've had announcements since the new government's been in place about clean energy, the Great British Energy Bill. One or two folks worried about where that sits along, obviously, the winter fuel rebate payments having been reduced and now being means tested. Apparently, those are not linked. We'd hope that was true. And just important there, the Crown Estate Bill to make, removes restrictions to allow easier investment in public infrastructure, and hopefully that means some positive things in terms of renewables. So those are the things closer to home. Just to make one statement extra about COP29, everyone is talking about net zero, but not everyone defines what it is. And that is an issue. We do, of course, have ISO's working group guideline on what net zero is, but we still don't have an international and truly independent definition of what it is. This is coming for COP30, and maybe it's pretty amazing that we haven't seen this yet. COP30, of course, is happening in Brazil, and that is next November. So that is when we do get the independent definition. Here at SBN, we really like ISO standards because, say for maybe paying a few pounds for the actual documents, those are completely free to use and are independent of any particular brand. So that's one certainly to get your hands on. If you haven't got the guideline already, scan the QR code. I think the link is at the end as well. It's certainly something to be familiar with because there are quite a lot of definitions out there and they're all home brand definitions. This is the one to go for. These sessions would only always have to mention ESOS because I know so many of you have been doing ESOS. I'd like to say have just finished ESOS phase 3. Now, of course, we're in the stage of putting our action plans online. And the good news is, even though it has been delayed, the ESOS portal is now open and you can put your ESOS action plans on there. Just to notice that new timeline there for March, you need to get everything in by then, even if you're not going to do any reductions over the time, you still need to put that in, which sounds a little bit weird, but it is what it is. I guess, and I'd hope within phase 4, we see specific requirements for reductions rather than just reporting. That's probably, I think, where it's going to go. But for now, there aren't those things, but you still do need to put your action plan online, even if it's got nothing in it. The EA has said that they are going to publish those. So whether, you know, what that's going to look like by putting a document out so you're committed to doing nothing, I don't know. You go figure. What we've also seen over the last couple of months is what happens if you find yourself on the wrong side of the Environment Agency for whatever reasons. I know that a number of you have asked about what does an enforcement notice, what does a compliance notice actually look like? So here goes. This is what they actually do look like. This is, okay, this is the compliance notice, first of all. Obviously, you know, some details there redacted for obvious reasons. What I want you to look at here are the dates on these. So you can see that this particular business received this in the middle of September. They were asked to respond 2 weeks later. What were they asked to respond with? Well, what the EA wanted to check is whether they qualified as a large entity in the UK's description of what a large entity is versus an SME. There are more details actually on our website. I'm sure I can get Dan to post that in the chat if you want to check against this. What I want to take away from this is what happens. And you can see the EA is, you know, it is very keen on this happening, and you can see what the penalties there are if you don't respond. So 2 weeks, otherwise you could end up with a £5,000 fine straight off the bat with a daily charge as well. So certainly something to respond to very quickly. Just bear in mind those dates. Let's have a look at what happened beyond this compliance letter. Within a month of sending in, this company then got another letter being the enforcement notice. Okay, you can see the date on the top of that. That's the end of October. And this required them to complete the ESOS audit. So they quite rightly held their hand up and said, okay, we have missed this. We need to do something about this. So then what we're told on the next section of the letter is that needs to be in January. So you can see there from receiving that initial compliance letter to the enforcement is 4.5 months, which I think must be incredibly frustrating for loads of us that done their ESOS quite a while ago now. And, you know, with the original dates, this would be, you know, more than a year late. We are where we are. And to be honest, if for whatever reason you did miss the ESOS, and most commonly what we see is because folks didn't realise that 2-year rule on the size of the business, okay, being a large entity for 2 consecutive years at the time that the ESOS is valid. So it is quite a subtle point. So there is some leeway in here, but to be honest, you're going to need those 3 months to get the audits done and get the paperwork right. You've either got to skill up to do it or engage a consultant who's still doing ESOSs. So I think it's a reasonable timescale, even though it must be very frustrating for quite a lot of folks. Let's have a look at a bit of legislation then. And I was in another event a few weeks ago, and jaws dropped at this one. It seems not too many people know about the tighter waste restrictions coming through. You can all read off on the screen what's happening there. The one that seems to be surprising people the most is the food waste segregation. And you can see for businesses with more than 10 full-time employees, requiring, if you have more than 5 kilos of food waste, that you need to segregate this. Now, my colleague, Dr. Duncan East, is going to be doing another SBN in January that's going to tackle this whole subject. So I'd be very interested to find out what this means specifically if you're in, say, serviced accommodation, as we are here. I think there's more than 400 people in the business, in businesses here, from several different companies, and where the responsibility sits within that particular regime. So please do watch this space, and because you're on today, obviously you'll get early notification of that session, which we're going to be doing in January. So some really interesting new legislation, and it seems to not be too well known about. We always talk about fines. Obviously, we've mentioned there about ESOS and potential fines. Here are the latest ones, and as ever, we inevitably end up talking about the water sector. Here's the latest one from Severn Trent, which is very unfortunate there. And I think this one is what you'd call an enforcement undertaking, whereby Severn Trent obviously have been convicted here, done something really not good. The money has gone to the Wildlife Trust, which is fantastic. I think, that's wholly appropriate. It's gone to where it's needed, rather than perhaps going directly into government coffers and then it being perhaps a little less than transparent exactly where that's gone. So I think, that enforcement undertaking is a positive thing there. We also welcome the next bullet there about our new government launching an independent waste commission. I'm sure they're going to look at all of this and the reasons why we see fines, huge fines, time after time after time from this sector, and it needs sorting out. I think within that will be a structural review, and who knows, maybe they will look at whether it's appropriate for the water companies to remain in the private sector or move to public ownership again. That's only my opinion. Finally, on there, we see more fly tipping fines. I could argue those aren't particularly high. Not reporting here any custodial sentences. Maybe they were short on resource, or maybe just it got better. Who knows, but we'll keep you posted on what's going on there in fines at the next session. Just a few links there at the end. If you do want to have a look at those, I appreciate those will be coming through here quite quickly. They will be on the YouTube description, so please do check out those slides a little bit later. That takes us back then to our agenda screen, and I'm just going to spend a second there. I can see that you all are putting in your responses there on the survey. It is completely anonymous, so please do, let's get as many as possible on here, and we will have a look at that after our main speakers today. And I'm delighted to introduce Dan Lovelace and Tom Vaughan from Carbon Footprint. And I think it's going to be Tom who's going to lead off on that. Over to you, please, Tom.
Thank you, Wendy. So first of all, what is a product carbon footprint? It's a way of measuring the carbon footprint of a product. So usually measured in grams or kilograms of CO2e per unit or kilogram of product. And we measure different elements. So first of all, the embodied emissions of the raw materials. So if you've got metals and plastics, we account for that. the transportation of the raw materials to your factory. So either by sea freight, truck, and then the distance. The energy in the manufacturing of the products in the factory, so the kilowatt hours of electricity and other fuels you might use, and then the product distribution from the factory to your customers with the transport type. And then if this applies the use of the product, so if it consumes energy, and then the disposal of the product as well. So why would you want to calculate a product carbon footprint? So there are both environmental benefits and business benefits. So the environmental benefits would obviously include, identify and reduce carbon emission hotspots. So you might, for example, find out that you've been air freighting a lot of your products to customers, which is very carbon intensive, and this will show up, and you can think of ways to reduce these hotspots and maybe switch this air freight to sea freight. You can also, through looking at your carbon footprint for the product, develop more sustainable processes and designs. So this might include switch out materials for less carbon intensive ones. And overall, you'll contribute to climate change mitigation, which is obviously very urgent right now. And then there are also business benefits. So you'll enhance your brand reputation and customer loyalty. A lot of people are very environmentally conscious now. And you might also, you'll gain a competitive edge in the market. Another key one is to comply with regulations and meet sustainability targets. So the EU set a lot of regulation, and you might be a mandatory requirement for you to comply with this. And also your customers might ask to see information on your product carbon footprint for their own net zero targets and supply chain screening. And this is one way you can provide that. And you'll also gain cost saving opportunities. So the example of the air freight's a lot more expensive than sea freight. So if you switch this to sea freight, you're not only reducing your carbon footprint, but you'll save money through this as well. So this is a compliance and regulation which the EU are leading in this. So there's CBAM and ESPR, which I'll mention later, and there might also be sector-specific requirements in your specific industry. So we've got the paper industry, for example, and automotive. So an example of an EU legislation is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, so CBAM. And this is it's designed to address carbon leakage and encourage global decarbonization. So it basically accounts for the import of goods to the EU from non-EU countries. So this will affect UK exporters. And you have to declare what materials are used in your products. So at the moment, carbon intensive products, so iron and steel, fertilizer, cement, hydrogen. And there's different phases. So you might already be required to do this. And the idea is that you will have to eventually pay tax on the amount of carbon content in your products. And they start with the most carbon intense products and then gradually phase in up to 2034 onwards. So all goods and materials imported into the EU will be taxed under the CBAM. And by completing a carbon footprint assessment, you can provide the relevant data on how much carbon is associated with your product. Another example of an EU regulation is the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation. And the key goal with this one is to make products more sustainable throughout their life cycle. So it doesn't just focus on the carbon side, but there's also a lot more design requirements. So the eco-design requirements, which includes improving product durability, reusability, and repairability, and then making products more energy efficient, increasing the recycled content of the materials, limiting waste, and improving availability of information on product sustainability, which is a key one. So by doing this, you'll be required to introduce a digital product passport, which will be an accessible tag on the products that makes sustainability information available. So it's not clear yet what this would include, but it's most likely will include technical performance, the materials and traceability, how easily repairable they are, and for a product carbon footprint, life cycle environmental impacts. So the amount of greenhouse gases, so CO2e, associated with that product could be on this digital product passport. And then here is a timeline. So it's quite a recent regulation. So it started off in March 2022, and then similar to CBAM, they'll phase in all products are expected to be phased in by 2030, and they will start with the most carbon intensive. Even though it might not affect you within the next couple of years, it's always good to prepare and take steps and get all these processes set up so you're ready, because it does take time the first year of doing this. So another reason you might want to assess your carbon footprint is consumer demand. So supply chains, a lot of customers are looking into their supply chains and they'll have net zero targets. So they may ask for product carbon footprint assessments of your product so they can make informed decisions about which products they choose. Transparency, so sharing a product's carbon footprint with consumers demonstrates transparency and accountability. And there's a lot more environmentally conscious customers, and they like to have the choice and transparency of choosing a product that has minimal environmental impact. Now we'll go on to Dan, who will take you through how to do a product footprint.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So those are all the reasons for why you want to do a product footprint. Now let's get into how you would actually do one. So first thing to say is there's a few different standards for relating to product footprints. First one was PAS 2050, which was introduced in 2008, revised a few years later. There's Greenhouse Gas Protocol Product Standards, which was released in 2011, and the ISO 14067, which was published in 2018. And there's what all of those look like there. In terms of which one we recommend you using, all the standards cover broadly similar points. We're going to focus mainly on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as it's widely used currently. It goes into the most depth about different parts of the life cycle and sort of methodology. It's also what we use for our own calculations of carbon footprint. We also use the ISO standards for more sort of general guidance. The GHG protocol is yeah, as I say, the most in-depth. So it's what we're going to be focusing on. And it's also free to access at this link here. If you just look up GHG protocol product standard, it will take you there. Key point to make clear is that the term sort of LCA life cycle assessment gets thrown around a lot when it comes to this stuff. It's not necessarily the same thing as a carbon product footprint. When we talk about carbon product footprint, we're only accounting for the product's greenhouse gas emissions in its lifetime, which is reported in terms of CO2 equivalent. A life cycle assessment will nearly always cover GHG emissions as well, but it could also cover other impact areas, which could include air pollution, resource depletion, ozone depletion, water use, land use, lots of other environmental factors. We're going to be focusing on GHG emissions in this session, as it's the most commonly covered aspect. It will nearly always be covered in an LCA. Arguably, it's the most important aspect, and it is our specialty at carbon footprint as well. So this is a quick graphical overview of product life cycle from the greenhouse gas protocol. So product starts from nature, because everything comes from nature, basically. And then from there, you acquire the materials for making your product and any pre-processing that's needed. There's then the production stage where the product is actually produced. Once it's produced, you have to sell it, so you distribute and store it if needed. Then there's the use phase, which I'll explain a bit more. It'll only apply to certain products, ones where there are emissions associated with using it. And finally, there's the end of life, which is the sort of disposal part of it, which will either be sort of landfill, incineration, or recycling or reuse. Key thing to mention is that if a product is recycled or reused, it stops being part of that product life cycle. The sort of recycled product then becomes part of the next product life cycle. So it doesn't just keep going forever. So I'm going to take the example of a plastic water bottle to sort of go in a bit more depth about these stages. So to make a water bottle, you first need to get the materials, and plastic's made from oil. So the material acquisition would cover the extraction of oil, refining, and then the oil gets transformed into plastic pellets. Then there's the production. So the pellets get heated up and shaped into bottles. And if it's a water bottle, it'll also get filled with water. Then you have the distribution. So if it's bottles from any major retailer, those are transported to the store by lorry or sea freight or air freight or whatever it is. Another important point is that if the contents of the bottle require refrigeration, so if it was something like fruit juice that needs to be kept chilled, then the emissions of keeping it refrigerated would have to be factored into this stage as well. Then you have the usage. So again, it doesn't apply to water, but if it was a food product, for example, that requires heating or cooking before you can eat it, then the emissions of using microwave, for example, would have to be factored into the use phase. Same if it was like an electrical device, you're accounting for the electricity used in that product's lifetime. And then finally, there's the end of life. So you might think, oh, well, all water bottles are recycled, and they all can be recycled, but not all of them tend to be recycled. So what you would probably do is calculate a split between recycling, incineration, and landfill, because bottles could go to any of these. And yeah, as I mentioned before, once it goes to the recycling facility, its life ends, and any further emissions are passed on to whatever product it becomes next. So those are all the stages. Important distinction to make is there's two common sort of scopes of product footprint assessment. You have cradle to gate and cradle to grave. So cradle to gate assessment covers only the upstream emissions of the product, so from the material acquisition to the point where it leaves the factory gate. So in terms of the water bottles, that would be once the bottles are finished being produced, the life cycle well, the cradle to gate assessment ends at that point, so you're not accounting for distribution, use, end of life. Whereas cradle to grave will cover the full life cycle, right up to the end of life disposal, which is the grave part. In terms of what's best, it depends on the product at the time. Some products are very difficult to account for the use phase of. So clothing, for example, you need to account for the clothes being washed, but how many times is a shirt washed before it's disposed of? It's very difficult to say. Or you might not know how the product will be used if you're producing materials, for example, that are then used in other processes. Very difficult to measure the usage emissions of that. And finally, there are other less common scopes available. So cradle to customer would be one where you would go from the material acquisition up to the point where the product is distributed. So you're not accounting for use and end of life, but you are accounting for distribution. There's other options as well. Cradle to gate and cradle to grave are the most common ones. So the next thing would be, all this stuff, how do I start calculating? And there's three main approaches that we identified to doing a product footprint. So there's the sort of DIY approach where you would collect all the data and calculate everything in-house. A consultant-led approach, working with a consultant or a consultancy to collect the data and carry out the calculations. And the software-led approach, there's lots of LCA software out there, so that's a valid option as well. All of the approaches have pros and cons. So in terms of the DIY approach, this would be the cheapest option to go with at the outset. You would have full control over the process because you're in control of everything. And if it's the first of many product footprints you're planning on doing, so it will build knowledge for those future projects to make it easier in the long term. Some cons is that a sort of unverified approach like this maybe has greater potential for errors. There's obviously a big time commitment in learning the methodology, calculation process, and to find appropriate emission factors, which get a bit more into just after this. Another point is that though it is sort of free at the outset, if you need a database, it can be a significant cost. So I'll talk a bit more about EcoInvent later, but it's a popular database, but a license can cost, for a first-time user, it's sort of at least £3,000, so quite a significant investment. In terms of the consultant-led approach, some pros are that you can get easy access to databases like EcoInvent that might otherwise be expensive. It will have more credibility if you can put a consultancy's sort of name under it, saying it's been verified by this company. You'll benefit from the experience and knowledge of consultants, which will also help your own knowledge of the process. It might be the best approach if you're doing sort of hero product, like your flagship product, or just small product ranges where there's only a few calculations, and as opposed to the software-led approach we'll get into, they may be best for large-scale calculations. In terms of the consultant-led cons, obviously you have less control than if you're doing it yourself. There's potential for sort of disagreement between yourself and the consultant's approaches, and though you're sort of saving time by using the consultancy's expertise, you won't learn as much yourself about the process. So finally, there's the software-led approach. So in some cases, this will be the most efficient approach because you won't need to put together databases and spreadsheets and stuff. It will be built into the software. You also might already have factors built into the software, emission factors that is, so you won't need to find these or pay a lot for them. And in terms of large scale calculations, if you need to calculate 50 products where the details are mostly the same, it's just one or two differences in each one, then software may be best for that, for just running the same sort of process lots of times. Its cons, an obvious con is that software can be very expensive, upwards of £10,000-20,000 for some LCA software, and it might be sort of fixed in what it can do. It might not be able to account for sort of small nuances in your product that you want to be captured in the assessment. So we touched on emission factors. In terms of where you can find them, we have Carbon Database Initiative, CADI, which is a free database of lots of things, but it includes product and material emission factors from sources like DEFRA and ADEME. It also has region-specific electricity factors of over 200 countries. So you want to capture the manufacturing emissions of, well, the electricity emissions in your manufacturing. You can do that for pretty much any country using those factors. You can access it on this link here, also a QR code on screen there. And then the other main database touched on is EcoInvent, which is comprehensive and it has lots of stuff, including sort of chemicals, stuff that is hard to, that you won't find much information on. But it does require a license to access, and as well as the initial license cost, they update the factors each year, and to get the newest update, you have to pay an additional fee each year. So it's a cost commitment there.
So you've assessed your carbon footprint, you know the result. You've got your grams of CO2 per product. So what now? Well, first of all, you'd identify any hotspots. So pinpoint any areas with the highest carbon emissions. So this could be anywhere from the embodied materials or the logistics of you using a supplier, which is all the way in China, and you're in the UK. That's a long way to travel, so that's a lot of carbon. And then once you've found any hotspots, you'll look at reducing your footprint for the product. So you would look into any low-hanging fruit, stuff that's relatively affordable and will make the greatest impact. So for example, if your factory, you could switch to 100% renewable electricity, that could make a big impact. And it's not too expensive. Another one is that the air freight. If you switch that to sea freight, you're also saving money and potentially significantly reducing your emissions. So then once you've reduced as much as you can, you might choose to offset any residual carbon using high integrity carbon offset projects. And in that way you can be carbon neutral. And then once you've done all that, you could look into remeasuring. So ideally every 2 years you do another updated carbon footprint on the product. And that way you can potentially and hopefully see reductions after you've put in those processes for reducing. And it's a good way to track progress. And then you should communicate and engage. So it's always good to share with stakeholders your achievements if you've reduced, or just your results. So you can have a carbon assessed logo you can put, and the results and the reduction year on year, and disclosing that so you can put the results on a public database such as CADI, as Dan mentioned earlier, and then you can compare yourselves to similar products in industries. And you shouldn't be afraid to disclose your footprint. Transparency is key, definitely. So now if you look at it from the other side and you're looking to purchase a product, for example, and you've got all these green claims, and it can be confusing what to look out for. So some good signs about a claim is that it's clear and specific. So always backed by evidence, you know what's been included in the assessment, if it's cradle to gate or cradle to grave. If it's been third-party certified, is always a good sign. So you know it's correct and everything's been accounted for. And quite often you can ask for the product footprint assessment, so a comprehensive assessment of the footprint, so you can check yourselves. And if they have used carbon offsetting, it's always good to check the source of that of the projects for high integrity, and everything should be transparent. One thing to look out for with carbon offset projects is their leakage, additionality, permanence, and measurability. Some warning signs for green claims are claims that are vague and ambiguous. So the overuse of generic terms like eco-friendly or sustainable, but they don't actually specify any other details or mention the CO2e results. Any self-proclaimed claims, so that they aren't necessarily backed by a third-party certification or been verified. So yeah, it's always a good sign if they are third-party verified. And just general lack of transparency, so you don't know what's been included in the assessment, any assumptions that might have been made. So it's always good. I think the first thing is transparency in data. What have they included in this assessment? So here are the summary and key takeaways. So we've looked at what is a product footprint and why you might want to do it with EU regulation or pressure from your customers, specific key regulation and compliance. And then Dan looked into how you measure it and the different methodologies and what one could be best for you. And then once you've got this result, what do you do with it now, and ways to disclose your results and hopefully reduce your emissions year on year. And then looked into green claims, any warning signs or green flags. And there we go.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan and Tom. So we'll come to that in just a second. I'm going to try and share the screen of the live poll, and I'll do my best to keep up with it. So as I say, it is completely anonymous. Dan, can you just if you can drop the long link into the chat again, that will be great. Here we are. The first question we asked was how many of you have actually done this already? And yeah, some even splits really between those of you who have and those of you who haven't. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the panel now, Tom, Dan, Harsha and Leah, to, if you'd like to switch your videos on and unmute yourselves. I think what we'll start off is just with some commentary on how these numbers are looking, just descriptive here. So that first one, yeah, I mean, reasonably even. I think I'll go first, Harsha, for a quick comment. Does that surprise you? And then I'll move to Leah. The numbers that are doing it at the moment.
No, not really, does it? I think if you take the majority of them, you'll see the majority haven't done it. So I don't think that surprises me at all, really.
Good stuff. Leah, any comment on those numbers, those splits from your perspective?
I would agree. I'm actually probably more surprised at how many have done it, to be honest, because I think it's a whole new step in carbon footprinting as well.
Yeah, and I think, here from what Tom, you were talking about, this is the start of the major EU legislation. So I think that's actually quite positive. Here we go. Let's have a look at the second one. Please keep voting. I know these numbers will change, but I think directionally it'll be correct here. Here's what is your main driver for being interested in product footprinting? Let's have a look and seeing what the large slices of the pie. Interesting stuff. Consumer interest showing quite large. Actually, this is reasonably well split, isn't it? Actually, supply chain requests. I'm going to go to Leah. Actually, does that surprise you on what we see here?
Well, from my point of view, I thought the supply chain request might be higher. Because that tends to dictate what you footprint for your products. So I'm quite surprised with that. The consumer interest is the 30%, which I think it depends on your business, if you're direct to consumer or if you're supplying to something to go to consumer. So
is it worth just saying a little bit for those of you who don't know Leah so much at Vitacrest, if you could just remind us what's the model there? Obviously we all enjoy your products on a daily basis. My fridge is full of them. You have an interesting model. Just to maybe say a little bit more about that and how you interact with consumers and take this view on product footprinting here.
So we're a major salad and herb grower and processor and distributor to the major UK retail food retailers and the Portuguese retailers as well for food. So essentially we're a supplier for own brand products in the big supermarkets. So you'll see the bag salads, the pot herbs, the bowls of salads. That's probably grown on our farms and then go through our processing. So we are, as a key supplier to those supermarkets, we're actually required to report on our greenhouse gas emissions so that those supermarkets can then report back on their greenhouse gas emissions and where there are reductions. And there's a major drive at the moment in the UK food retailer network to reduce emissions, and that's putting an incredible pressure on supply chains, as you can imagine.
Right.
So we have a lot of products. So every salad mix is a different product. Every piece of leaf you see in a salad bag is grown on a farm somewhere. And it could be in the UK, it could be our own farms, it could be someone else's farms, it could be a European farm. Some of the herbs could be imported from anywhere around the world because they don't grow in this country. So there is a huge supply chain under us, so to speak. And so product footprinting is really difficult for us. We need to do full life cycle analysis because we have to include growing conditions, which is soils, water in different countries. We don't so much with emissions to air, but we have a whole host of different areas we have to focus on. So engaging with our supply chain is key in terms of getting this information. But data is the most difficult information to get. And when you've got several products, that data is really difficult when you want them to be consistent, especially. So I can talk a bit more about it if you want now, Wendy.
I think we do have a question at the end, and I think we probably will slightly move forward if it's okay, everyone on the call, because we have asked the question about how easy it is to get information on products and services from your suppliers. So I think I'd like to stay with Leah on that point, given the results we're seeing here, of knowing how do you go about, is there a best way? We know it can be difficult. It can be difficult with suppliers. Are there some strategies? Do you focus on specific areas that have the biggest impact? How do you go about, for a lot of us, we might have hundreds of different suppliers. How do you prioritize that seemingly impossible task of data collection from all those suppliers?
Yes, so we basically start with our greenhouse gas inventory and the materiality assessment. So we're currently setting our targets for Science-Based Target Initiative. So this has been a great exercise for us this year, and it's highlighted the areas mainly in Scope 3, Category 1, which are our purchased goods and services, and that's where our raw material supplies, so our actual leafy products and herb products sit in, and also our packaging suppliers. As well as our fertilizer suppliers, our pesticide suppliers, and every aspect that comes into growing a salad for market. So we've had a materiality assessment, and we knew this would happen. We knew it would be packaging, and we knew it would be our raw material suppliers would be the most impactful in terms of that category. So what we've done as a parallel process is that we've sent a questionnaire out to our raw material suppliers and our packaging suppliers, a very basic one, asking first, have you got a carbon footprint? It's the first question. If you have, does it cover scopes 1, 2, and 3? If it does, could you provide that information? And if you provide that information, what percentage of your business supplies Vitacress? And that's absolutely key, because this is also what we do for retailers. We say what percentage of our business supplies that retailer. So the surprise results were really surprising, actually. A lot of the packaging suppliers don't have a greenhouse gas inventory, which was quite surprising because a lot of them are very big. And where they do have a greenhouse gas inventory, it's limited, absolutely limited. And and it's not annual either, so we can't get a good, consistent data from them. The raw material suppliers, however, much better. So farming has gone off on its own route with footprinting. They use free tools, which are on the market, designed by farmers and used by farmers. And the majority of our raw material suppliers have been able to supply us with their carbon footprints. So we can now focus in on those suppliers that have the biggest impact on us. What we've done, yeah, sorry, I'll go after that. I'll come back to that after, Wendy.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Let's go back up the list, and I know we're jumping around a little bit, but I did want to make that little neural connection there with the supply chains. Okay, let's move down to biggest challenge in doing carbon footprints. Here's an interesting one with splits here between lack of supply chain engagement, and Leah's obviously already spoken about that, resource and the issues around that. I think I'm going to go to Harsha now, and it's probably worth just, Harsha, if you can just let the folks know exactly what De La Rue does if they're unfamiliar with the business, and just to talk about the resource implications of doing product footprints. I can also see a question or some comments in the chat as well about a preferred methodology to use, and I know that's something that you're very keen on as well. So maybe if you could take us through how you go around resourcing, what the resource implications are of doing product footprinting, and your preferred methodology, and why that is. That's 3 questions, isn't it?
Sure. I'll start off with a very quick introduction. So I work for De La Rue, which is a global business. Our headquarters are in Basingstoke, and we work with central governments, in global government ministries and international bands across 2 of our divisions, which are currency and authentication. And obviously, currency, in the name, we provide currency service, which includes banknote printing and banknote substrate production for a lot of central banks around the world. And one of the most recent things we've done is worked on an LCA for our banknote business, which is what I've experienced with. But we also do some product carbon footprinting for our authentication division as well. I think to touch base on the second question, which was on the resource and time and skills, the most recent, we have a model that we've built that essentially takes our production data and helps us compute the carbon footprint of our banknote production. And we first built this model back in 2019 with a software provider. And we tend to update this every 2-ish years. And our most recent update took an entire year in terms of identifying, firstly, doing a gap analysis in terms of what is there anything in the model that changed in terms of the background data that went into it. Is there anything touching on the supplier engagement that we didn't get from the supplier previously that the supplier can now update us on? Is there anything that we need to check as a material change from the last time we've updated? And obviously, I acknowledge that this is more of an update, but it's very much the same when you first start doing the process. It's all about assessing the scope of what you're working with. So all of that took time, and I think because we did ours slightly differently. A lot of our suppliers do the carbon footprinting, they do their own GHG emissions reporting, but for our model we wanted to break down by the process so we could ensure we were modelling this correctly. So we asked them to say, can you for this production of 100 tons of product that you're doing for us, can you split it all out into inputs and outputs, and actually the electricity, the energy used, and then we needed a breakdown in terms of actually what raw material, what type of energy are you using, what type of waste it was going to. And that level of detail, at first glance, it takes a lot of time to compile, both from a supplier perspective, but also for us to take that detail in and then complete it. And that's and to answer your third question there, Wendy, about how often we do it. And I think I mentioned we do this every 2 years. Yes. And that's because we do get our carbon footprint. We don't do a verification often with the model, but because we do provide it to international, governments and central banks and everything. There are requirements sometimes on occasion if it's for used for external reporting. We do go for verification, and in that sense, we all of this is to the ISO 14067 standard, and for that purposes, when we get a nice little verification label after a long time of making sure it's all correct, that label or that certification is only valid for 2 years.
Right.
So that is why we like to make sure we're always updating, because while there is no certain, at least certainly from what I understand, what I know, there's no time in terms of once you do this carbon footprint, it's not like it's obsolete after a certain number of years, or there's nothing in the standard that says it's obsolete. But it's very important to know that whenever you do your carbon footprint, it's got to be representative of that time period.
Yeah,
and if you're using
absolutely.
Yeah.
I guess, a lot can happen. If we take the analogy here, panel, between regular carbon accounting that we all put in our annual reports, by definition, we're doing it each year. And that makes sense. It looks to me from, the presentation and what we're saying here on the panel, of around about 2 years is typical. Certainly that's what I hear quite a lot. And whether it's not so much specified in the standard, but when you look at the quality of the data and what would happen over those 2 years, perhaps that's the pragmatic choice and balance with resource. Is that a fair comment?
I think that's fair. That's definitely fair. If it takes you a year, or in our case takes you several, it's not easy to sit down and do this in a month or two. It's something that's, you've got to be very specific to the methodology. And once you get that, if you want to do that properly, it does take time. So 2 years does make a lot of sense.
Good stuff. Great. Okay, shall we have a look down some of our other categories here? So biggest challenges to footprinting. Okay, lack of supply chain engagement. We did that already. The reasons what are you going to do with your results? This is a little bit mixed again, really. Let's go to Leah. Does that surprise you with the results there? Perhaps more mixed than...
I'd say I wasn't surprised. I'm a little bit hesitant about using this for marketing. because this is where we get into that territory of is it valid? Can you use it for marketing? Our business ourselves, we have no say over what goes on packaging because we are an own brand supplier. However, we have all these standards and we certainly wouldn't use them for marketing, but to support the decarbonisation, it's really good to see that at 33%. And I would say actually for us, a product footprint or a life cycle analysis would be about supporting decarbonisation and yes, some reporting to our customers, but the majority would be the decarbonisation. So I'm yeah, I mean, legislation, it's good to see that's a much smaller percentage because then most of us aren't legislation led as well. It's doing it for the right reason.
It will be interesting to see as ESPR, I'm now looking at Tom, as that starts to take hold. I suspect that that picture will start changing. And even though obviously sitting here in the UK, we're not in the EU any longer, a lot of us are still feeling the pull of the EU. So I suspect that we'll quite a number of us are going to go in alignment with that. I'm probably going to put this question across to, I think it's to Tom and Dan, really taking up that point about marketing of the product footprints. What things do we see that go wrong with it? And I guess there's two sides of this. One will be what typically goes wrong in the calculation, and the second one being what goes wrong in the claim from a technical report translating to what goes in a press release or something online. So maybe we'll go to Dan first of what goes wrong in the calculation where you've seen it go wrong for product footprints.
I think it's. Oh, could you mute yourself, Wendy? So actually, I'll do it. Don't mind. I think it's important when you're like starting the assessment to clarify exactly what your what we call sort of the system boundary is, or what your sort of functional unit is. In terms of we're measuring the footprint of one of these products, or like 1 kilogram of this, or like what is it actually that you're measuring? Because otherwise you can get confused thinking you know, how do we measure the transport? Are we measuring transport of one thing, or is it the whole box of products? So it's very important to clarify that. It's also important to make sure that you're covering everything in your process. Sometimes you can go through the assessment, it looks like everything's done, and then client could say, oh, I forgot we also had this something that was part of the process. We need to go back and account for that. And it's not a problem, of course, but it makes the whole process smoother if it's sort of clarified at the outset exactly what's included, exactly what we need to collect, and go from there.
Are you recommending then that if you're doing a product footprint, that you draw some kind of a flow chart, your process flow chart, and be absolutely clear that you've covered everything that you need to? Is it something like that, just to make sure there aren't any blind spots in it, really?
I think that would be helpful, yeah.
Okay, good stuff. And over to Tom, what is it with the claim that goes wrong, do you feel, that you've seen?
I think generally just lack of transparency. It goes with this discussion of finding it difficult to collect the data, and that seems that's always going to be the case at some point with so many suppliers. So there's always going to be at some point assumptions being made if you can't get that data, and I think it's important to just not be afraid to mention those assumptions. It's going to happen at some point. We're in the early phases of carbon footprinting, and until this dominoes effect occurs where everyone's going to assess, and then things will get easier as the data will get better. I don't think it should be a bad thing to make assumptions. You shouldn't be ashamed of it.
Good stuff. I think one thing that bugs me is sometimes you just get a number on a product in isolation with no reference to anything else, and it would be great if the general public would know what a good footprint looks like. I think, we will get to a stage where that will happen, but there's a good degree of education that needs to take place. So my kids probably know what that is, but I'm not sure that, maybe aside from the school generation, I'm not sure that people generally know what is a good footprint. So having a comparison to something else and making sure that comparison is robust as well is probably a tough ask, but that's probably where it needs to go. Okay, great. Let's have a look. I think we're mostly there on the questions. Yeah, I think that just reinforces the point, doesn't it, on point 5. Is there enough information when you go to buy things? Just in general terms, probably quickly round the whole of the panel, do we find that there's enough carbon footprinting information from folks that we try to procure from? And you can put your answer as a business or as a consumer. How do we find this, folks? I'll go to Harsha first on that one.
I want to say it's a mix of both. It's certainly improved over the last couple of years, and I say that because I think I'm in a very privileged position that because of the nature of the business that I work in, it's a very niche industry. Mm-hmm. And recently there has been a big sustainability drive within the industry. So a lot of big players are now very much aware of product carbon footprints, very much aware about the importance of reporting on annual GHG emissions. So compared to about 2 years ago, where it was a bit of a wasteland and really hard trying to get any information, it has become a bit more open and a bit more easier to talk to suppliers. That being said, it is certainly the big players. If you've got a specialist small business, I think we're still doing a lot of the education and engagement piece at the moment. So it's a bit of a mix of, all suppliers. Some of our big suppliers do provide that information, and some of the smaller suppliers, they're still on their learning curve, and that's completely fine because we understand and we sort of work with them. But generally, I think we're in the industry I am, we're in a better position potentially than a couple of other industries.
Just to go over to Leah, and I know you've spoken a lot already, obviously, on the supply chain aspect, and it sounded to me there were good suppliers to your business, and maybe some needed to do a little bit more. Any more comment on that about generally?
Yeah, I'd agree with Harsha.
Information for a procurement.
Yeah, I'd agree with Harsha. It is getting better. I mean, the key is to have the procurement team fully integrated into this process, and right. That's something because if they're not on board, it's really difficult, and we don't want to bombard our suppliers with lots of different people asking questions all the time. I just wanted to answer this personally, if that's okay, from the personal point of view. No Vitacress hat. I am not keen on labels on anything because I think they confuse absolutely everything. I don't like the carbon neutral label. That's my own personal thing. It's nothing to do with Vitacress. But I just find labeling, until we have a standard or a system that actually allows labeling to be clear and understood, I personally don't buy products because they have a label on them. I need to look into a company to find out more about it.
Yeah.
But that's my personal opinion.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting, and I think as we go into the ESPR legislation, that the product passports, and even what we have on CADI, Carbon Database Initiative, is we have CADI passports where for a business there's an associated QR code. So that QR code goes straight on the product claim. So that's always the issue, I think, with the Advertising Standards Authority, is the claim has to be specific and it has to be as much as possible on the product. And obviously that can be tricky because it's valuable space, isn't it, on a product? It's usually not very much as well. And to get that on there on a QR code, I think is the way forward, because that will put the evidence right where it needs to be. So just picking up on a couple of things there in the chat. So yes, that evidence via that QR passport will tell you exactly what's going on. So we don't have to have a disembodied claim, or, you know, it can be a nice pretty icon or whatever that we see with saying thumbs up or it's green, and it has nothing quantitative behind it to evidence it. I think with these kind of product passports, we'll go to a new level where that will have exactly the science, it'll have the quantitative numbers behind it, which is exactly what you want to see, and that will keep the ASA nice and happy, and rightly so, because obviously consumers, whether in business or end users, need to be protected in this way. That's great. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, it's like what you mentioned before, Wendy, about from a personal consumer, it's difficult to know. Like, for example, if it was a pen, 50 grams of CO2 for a pen, you don't know if that's a good carbon footprint for a pen or not. And it's only going to be useful until all these pen companies assess that carbon footprint, and then you can have a comparison. But even then, it's still difficult with, you've got different size pens, different units. It does get quite complicated, I think. So I'm not sure from a consumer perspective how easy it's going to be to put that information out there, but be interesting to see where it goes.
Education is key here. I am actually really impressed with, I have 2 teenage kids, and they are really savvy. They understand very well what carbon is. They've got a sense of how much carbon is associated with the product, which is impressive, and isn't stuff that I've forced into them at all. So I think the kids are really important, and they are very good at pestering parents to make sure they're doing the right things. So I think they are definitely our secret weapons.
There was just a question in the chat about the ISO and GHG protocol approaches I just wanted to touch on.
Great, please do.
I think they're both relevant. I mean, it's very hard to summarize the difference between them quickly, but I would say the ISO is much more concise and sort of focuses on when you're reporting how should you report it, whereas the GHG protocol is more guidance. It has more worked examples. It's written sort of more like how a person would speak rather than just sort of legal text. So I would definitely refer to both if you're getting started.
Just to remind us there, Dan, which of those documents are available for people to freely view? I know it was on your slides earlier, just to really quickly recap.
The GHG protocol product standard is free to access. The ISO
Fantastic.
is a one-time payment, I think.
Right, before we finish then this morning, the SBN video database is live, so you can watch lots of really great content on there. We've got supply chain footprinting is there. We've got target setting. We've got how to make a green claim and biodiversity in the workplace. Lots of really great sessions that we've done now. So please do scan that code and go and have a look at that. We'll close the session then just to say a big thank you to our speakers and our panel. Thank you, Tom, Dan, Harsha and Leah for your fantastic contributions this morning. These sessions are supported by the 3 councils, being Basingstoke and Dean, Rushmore and Hart. So thank you so much to them for their support. We hope you've enjoyed today's session and very much look forward to seeing you at the next SBN.